This is the Get a Life podcast. Ex-Cult Conversations.
Aberdeen, Scotland, the scene of a pivotal moment in the history of the PBCC. Aberdeen was a culmination of a long series of events that marked a steady diversion from mainstream Christian church practices. Follow along through the story. This church represents the epicenter of the Aberdeen story. Here is James Taylor Jr., the man at the center of a scandal that shook what once considered itself a mainstream Christian church.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast, Ex-Cult Conversations. Today we have Richard and Carmen with us, and special guest David Shorto and Bradley McCallum is back. Today we're going to head into the Aberdeen incident, which was a very much long drawn out process. It wasn't necessarily just a one-time situation that happened. It had a lot of history behind it that we're going to get into. Bradley's going to dive in and shed some insight and highlight some areas that not necessarily everybody knows about. So I'll let you take it away, Bradley.
Thanks, Cheryl. I think this whole question of the Aberdeen incident is really key to understanding what's happened with the Brethren movement in the last 30, 40, 50 years, as well as understanding what everyone's experiences who were either alive during the time of Aberdeen or who were born in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It was not, like as you said, it was not just a single event. The Aberdeen thing, or the Aberdeen matter, the issue, or people just sometimes just call it Aberdeen. Yes, that refers to a singular event, but it is part of a much larger and much longer and much broader series of events that highlighted and brought to the front, or to the forefront, in my mind, the real issues with the Brethren movement. So, the event in Aberdeen in the summer of 1970 was Mr. Taylor being found in bed with a young married sister, 32, by my grandfather, Mr. Gardner. I mean, that's the fundamental crux of the issue. But the situation was much longer, much bigger. It both preceded it and continued until Mr. Taylor's death and later in 1970. And I think that's what's really important to remember, because when I was inside, and I'm sure it's still being taught today, I would imagine, but I was told it was an ambush. It was a specific event choreographed, managed by Mr. Taylor to draw out opposition from people who were opposed to him over many years, including my grandfather, led by my grandfather. And he had to take this measure because they had not opposed him openly, or they had not articulated their opposition to him. And so he had to take extreme steps to expose their opposition to him. But even on a superficial level, I mean, you can believe it if you want to. That's fine. Like, if somebody wants to believe that crap, then that's fine. But if you look at it just fundamentally, look at the facts of the situation, it doesn't hold water. It's just not true. I mean, if you believe the story that Mr. Taylor being in bed naked with Mrs. Kerr naked, which they lied about at the beginning, and then changed their tune and admitted it. If you believe that, fine. But you are obviously suspending God-given belief, God-given rationality, God-given sense of this isn't right. And that's the bottom line. But the situation, the whole argument that this had to be done, this appearance of taking on the appearance of infidelity and corruption, had to be done because nobody opposed you openly, is complete bullshit. It's complete bullshit. I mean, so, and again, I'm speaking all from memory and from my notes that I took as a kid. And my dad gave me all his diaries, weirdly, when I was in my 20s. So I have, years and years and years of diaries, which my father took copious notes of every meeting he went to, and lots of commentary in them. So there's a lot of stuff that I have a not personal experience of, but I just don't have any reason to believe my dad would have been lying to his diary. But starting, from 1905, 1906, 1908, and around the time JT died to the early 50s, the Brethren went through this kind of golden age of sort of they were genuinely a mainstream Christian church in many ways. There were things that were weird, that were eccentric, that were a bit out of the ordinary. But by and large, they were a conservative, extremely conservative.
Bradley, just a moment. Just go back to those dates. When JT died, this was 1952, wasn't it?
1953, I think, or 52. 52, 53.
You just said 1900.
But I said the period between 1902 or 1908. I don't remember exactly when FER died.
Took over from FER, right? Yeah. Okay. Fine.
So the period under JT was largely benign. I mean, there were skirmishes and there were challenges and there were some theological innovations that he did, like salvation in the assembly and different things, but broadly speaking, it was largely it was kind of mainstream, just on the fringe.
Mm-hmm.
And brethren lived with their relatives that weren't in fellowship. Brethren, my father, my grandmother would take him to visit his grandparents and his aunts and his uncles, none of which had ever been in fellowship. They had TVs in the house. They would stay there. They would eat, so this stuff was going on. Brethren had cottages by the sea. They would go and spend the summers there. They wouldn't come to meeting. A lot of them had record players, at least the people in my parents' circle did. They didn't have radios, but they had, record players. In outsiders, there was signs, all are welcome. You could bring colleagues from work to the meeting, to the preachings. The supper was always reserved for members only, but you could still attend. You just had to sit in the back. So broadly speaking, that 50-some year period was pretty mainstream. And then JT died, and it was either 52 or 53. And there was this period where a lot of different, there was a number of different brothers who were helping run the show, who were asked to serve at the London meetings. And this term, the universal meetings, always makes me chuckle, because I always think like, oh, did that include like brethren from Mars and brethren from Jupiter were coming in on a spacecraft? Anyway, the Levites meetings, or the universal meetings in London, I think in 53 and 54, I don't have it in front of me, but I think 53 and 54 were Mr. Gardner. I think 55 and 56 were led by Mr. Taylor. I think 57 and 58 were my grandfather. And then I think Mr. Cowell was asked to take 1959 to lead the conference of 59. And at least what I was told during growing up in there, and from my father's notes and letters and stuff, there was a lot of conversation about this being a time of mutuality, that there wasn't going to be another J&D, FER, JT, that there was this period of just, it was so harmonious and everybody was getting along so well. It was just going to be a big love fest and a kumbaya thing. Then there was not going to be a head cheese until 1959. So, but what I do know happened is that I believe beginning in 1958, and David, you can correct me if I'm wrong on the date, JT Jr. started to minister So this would have been the second year that my grandfather had served at London. JT Jr. began to minister that being involved in an association was kind of in contravention of the fellowship. That if you were a member of a medical association, a legal association, if you were in any sort of professional association, or if you were a director in a worldly corporation, or if you were a brethren corporation that had worldly directors, that was all wrong, because they were bodies, and we as brethren could only be members of the body of Christ. And so therefore, all of those relationships had to be severed, which was a big deal, because there was a lot of brethren in the 50s who either held directorships or were in professional capacities as accountants or medical people or lawyers or whatnot. And the kind of the bastion of opposition to this, according to what I was told, the bastion of this was in England and Scotland, opposition. And it included everything from Greater London, where there were a lot of doctors, lawyers, engineers, professional accountants, people who belong, directors of various kinds, MDs and things, and treasurers and secretaries of corporations, up to stuff as kind of esoteric as in the Western Isles of Scotland. The Lewis family, I think they were Lewis. No, it was on the Isle of Lewis. Lawrence, the Lawrences, they were hugely involved in the Harris Tweed Association. So their business was Harris Tweed, and you could only sell Harris Tweed if you had the Harris Tweed Association logo and were a member of the thing. And so Mr. Taylor was like, no, this is all garbage. You have to leave all these associations. You have to leave your directorship.
Yeah, he was an uncle of mine, great uncle.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes. He married my grandmother's sister. Yeah, Cecil Lawrence. Yeah.
That's so. I have an aside, interesting story on that in just a moment.
Yeah,
on Cecil himself. But so there was all the stuff, and my grandfather, who was Scottish and who had lived in the States since the 1920s, still spent a huge amount of time every year, I don't know, multiple months every year in England and Scotland with all these people. You know, he really took up the flag of the anti-association matter people. And openly. There was none of this garbage that JT Jr. promulgated in 1970 that nobody had ever opposed him, and he had to draw out this hidden opposition. No, it wasn't. It was very open. And so so that happened. So the brethren, so Mr. Cowell, and to some degree my grandfather, but mainly pushed by Mr. Cowell, came up with this idea that there's a scripture that says, you know, about the children of Israel, that they shall not go out in haste. And so the idea was, no, they should not break off the legal contracts. They should not break off legal agreements. They should wind them up in a normal, orderly fashion. And when everything was done and handled in a quote unquote righteous manner, then we won't go into new ones. JT Jr. said, no, that's not the deal. So in 1959, Mr. Cowell was asked to take the meetings in London. He ministers on this, and he gets up in particular, and he ministers, or he's giving this word on they shall not go out in haste. And there's all this tension. My grandfather was sick, actually. He was in the house. There's a picture floating around, actually, of a bunch of people on the steps of PL's house.
Yep, I've got it. Yeah.
Includes like James III, my grandfather. I think Mr. Hales was there. Bunch of people. Anyway, so Mr. Cowell's gives us this word saying, you know, they shall not go out in haste, that the people of God need to be righteous and be orderly. JT Jr. confronts him in the meeting on the platform. Were you there, David, by chance?
No, but I heard this.
Yeah. He loudly, strongly confronted Mr. Cowell in the meeting. And this was like such a just a radical departure from what I understand of anything Brethren-esque at all, that everyone was sitting in like stunned silence. And JT Jr. is essentially saying this is wrong, you're wrong, that you're leading the people of God astray. This is garbage, the nonsense. I'm paraphrasing. And everyone kind of sat there and the meeting ended and that was it. And so everybody leaves London. There's this kind of weird vacuum because nobody really knows now what the hell's going on, because JT Jr. is like openly like declaring war on the rest of the people running the show, kind of in this weird coalescence of people. My grandfather gets home and my dad is at home and he comes down. I think this was the week following the London meetings. And my grandfather is apparently just sitting there staring into space, saying, he had a telegram on the table, open, and he was just saying, Mr. Cowell's been withdrawn from, Mr. Cowell's been withdrawn from, Mr. Cowell's been withdrawn from, just seemingly completely stunned, almost into kind of insensibility. So my dad said to him, well, what are you going to do? Like, my dad, I think, was in his late teens. Like, what are you going to do? Because like my grandfather was right, lockstep with Mr. Cowell. And he said, I don't know, Mr. Cowell's been withdrawn from, Mr. Cowell's been withdrawn from, Mr. Cowell's been withdrawn from. So what did happen was the next day, my grandfather asked my father to take some dictation, because my dad kind of acted as secretary to my grandfather, and to type up a confession to the Brethren in Detroit about being in opposition to the lead given by Mr. Taylor. So something happened, who knows what, where my grandfather decided to fold his cards and be like, no, this is it. I'm laying them on the table. I'm not going to I'm not going to try and, run the table. I am going to let this one play out. And I'm going to fold them now and just acknowledge I was wrong and support Jim Taylor. So interestingly, the Brethren in Detroit, simultaneously while this is all going on, are like, boom, we're going to act on SMCC. We're going to bring, so they call an assembly meeting and they say, we have to address this shit with you about associations and your opposition to JT Jr. So my grandfather shows up at the assembly meeting and all the brethren are there, and because that was in the day when you could actually answer your charges. That's gone out the window a long time ago. But back in those days, you could actually show up and say yay or nay. So they show up and they say, well, they open the thing by saying, you're being charged with, whatever it was. I don't remember the exact situation, but basically in opposition to JT Jr. in the ministry and the light of the Lord and Lord's word and the current movement of the Spirit and blah, blah, blah. My grandfather pulls out a piece of paper, typewritten, out of his Bible. And it's like, well, yes, I would agree. And he opens up the paper and proceeds to read his confession, completely flooring all the brethren who are there to withdraw from him. Completely throwing the whole meeting off course. So he reads this confession. He basically says, I've misunderstood the Lord's directives. I actually can see where I'm wrong and blah, blah, blah. We should, because JT Jr.'s thing was, so like Mr. Cowell and people like my grandfather were like, they shall not go out in haste. We should do things righteously. Mr. Taylor was like, no, it's righteousness to God before righteousness to man. And so if we now through this new revelation understand that our involvement in associations or involvement in directorships is unrighteous, then we need to leave those immediately to become righteous to God. And it's separated from evil and separated to God. So my grandfather reads this thing, and then everyone sits there. No one knows what to do, because clearly they had been given instructions to withdraw from him. And so, but he just confessed and repented and asked for forgiveness. So they're all sitting there. There's silence. There's this long period of silence. And there was some visiting brother there from somewhere else. And he says, finally, after this long, awkward, uncomfortable, nobody knows what's happening next silence, it's like, well, you guys have to forgive him. Like he just confessed, he's repented, he's asked for forgiveness. Like, so that's what they did. So they forgave him, and he kind of very narrowly missed his brush with death there, his brethren death. And then just really kept his head down. He was still asked to serve at meetings. He was still asked to do things, but he really kept his head down. And the Hales brothers, through all this, were very, very in touch with him and kind with him. And like all through that period and into the 60s, very much a part of my grandfather, my dad's lives. Like, in fact, in 1958 or 59, when all this crap was going down about the associations, and they were, John and Bruce Hales were kind of all around in the North America and England, and they're at the London meetings, and they're in all these pictures and stuff. They just kind of emerged out of nowhere. WBH marries Concy Taylor, Mr. Taylor's daughter, and at one point, Bruce Hales, they're at some conference somewhere. I don't remember where it was. And Bruce Hales says to my dad after one of the meetings, "Do you think anyone knows what's going on here?" Like, they were kind of looking at a group of brethren milling around. And do you really think anyone knows what's going on here? And my dad told me this over and over and over again. He's like, "I always wondered what Bruce meant. I always wondered what Bruce meant." But he never asked me. He didn't ask him at the time. He just said, like, "Oh, I don't know," or something. But in thinking back on it, I really wonder if Bruce was saying, like, does anyone know that we're taking over? Does anyone know that we're actually pushing the show?
Yeah. So this is Bruce Senior, uncle of the current one. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So that's just a weird kind of an aside. Mm-hmm. The other thing that happened in this period was in 1958. So JT Jr. was asked to serve at a conference in Detroit, and my grandfather was asked to serve at a conference in Manchester the same weekend, Manchester, Connecticut. And so he went to Manchester, and JT Jr. came to Detroit, and they served at these simultaneous meetings. And their entourages both landed at, like, Mr. Taylor's entourage was leaving Detroit, and my grandfather's entourage was coming back to Detroit, and they all ran into each other in the airport. this whole crew of people. And with Mr. Taylor was my mom and her parents. This is long before this is the really weird thing is this is long before my parents married. It's like 4 years before they married. So my mom and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, Mr. Hales, John Hales, and a group of other brethren. And with my grandfather was my dad, obviously, and a group of other brethren from Detroit. And my grandfather at that time was just super pissed off about this whole association thing. This is before that whole assembly meeting shit. And so he just barges up to JT Jr. and just is like, I'm paraphrasing again, but like, what the effing hell? Like, this is so far off the rails. It is so bizarre. It is so stupid. It is so dumb. It's terrible what you're doing. You're tearing the brethren apart. You're doing this. And JT Jr. kind of stood there kind of like, oh, like, holy shit. Did not expect that. And apparently S. McC just raged at JT Jr. for like a number of minutes, who just stood there and took it. And when it was all done, basically just said, "Well, Stanley, you know where the troubles always come from," meaning, according to my dad, meaning the wealthy brethren of England and Scotland, basically. That there was this sort of elite in Scotland and England that opposed him, and that it's like, "Stanley, you're from there. You know what the problem is. Basically that all these rich brethren would lose their incomes." But I actually think in retrospect, that was probably the design of the whole thing. But anyway, they kind of split their ways. And then following that was the meeting with Mr. Cowell. But interestingly, in the late 80s or early 90s, I don't remember the exact year, it was after JHS had died and Mr. Hales was ascendant. My father, I think I mentioned in my last podcast, was just this huge John Hales supporter. He just thought John Hales was just amazing. And they talked relatively frequently. And at one point, we had a hymn book revision during that period. And John Hales talked to my dad about putting S. McC's hymns back in the hymn book. This is crazy shit. This is the complete crazy shit where as a teenager, I'm like, they know that JT Jr. was wrong. They clearly know because Mr. Hales talked to my dad about putting S. McC's hymns back in the hymn book in the 91 revision.
Wow, that's incredible.
And he actually quoted. It was 3-day meetings in North America somewhere where he quoted one of S. McC's hymns, "O Residence of Glory, God's Tabernacle." Then this hymn my grandfather wrote, but JT Jr. or JSH quoted it in a meeting in the 90s.
Interesting.
Anyway, but so I was like, John Hales. I think I actually, and I've said before, I have no personal issue with him. I thought he said really crazy things, and he clearly did really crazy things to people. But it was a very different sort of regime than JT Jr. or JHS or the current thing. It was different. It was kind of like Cardinal Ratzinger, there was this long period of decline with Pope John Paul II, where he was sick and everyone else was running the show and at the Vatican. I mean, JHS went through that same period, and then they elected a caretaker, which is essentially what happened with JSH. I mean, they elected this guy, kind of brethren, highly focused brethren guy as kind of caretaker while the rest of the crew got their shit together and took over. Anyway, kind of lost my train of thought on the whole JSH. And so it moves into the 60s. The whole system thing I don't need to go into. I think everyone knows the system thing. My grandfather kept his head down and out of the line of fire, and the Hales folk didn't really trouble him much. I don't know why they left him out of their firing line, but maybe they wanted a supporter at some point. And in JT Jr., though, during this period in 65, I believe it was, he was suddenly out of commission for a long period of time for medical treatment. But even my dad, who was, dyed in the wool arch supporter, believed it was for something to do with alcohol. I believe he was sent to a detox center or maybe being under treatment for some sort of alcoholism. He reemerges back on the scene, and that's when he brings out the Commerce in the Assembly thing and gets, John and Bruce are shut up. But then also during that period of 64, 65, 66, there was this stuff in Europe where JT Jr. would go to Europe. Apparently, I was told, he disappeared in Paris for a long period of time, like multiple days, like 4 or 5 days. They had to go and find him, and he was hanging out with people doing stuff. So Aberdeen was not new. I mean, his thing with ladies was not new. And then there was this his ministry in the early 60s is relatively eloquent. I mean, you read it, the meetings are normal. Then you get into the late 60s, and by this point, all the student protests are happening in the society at large. There's kind of the Counter-Reformation thing of the 60s going on. There's this huge, battling between, and he gets really bizarre, and he starts doing really strange shit. Like, you have to put your pets down. You have to shave your mustaches. You have to just random weird stuff. Like looking at it just sort of objectively, it's weird. It's weird.
Mhm.
And then you get into 69 and 70, and it really goes seriously off the rails. Like, clearly, I mean, he's drinking all the time. He's drinking in all the meetings. And even so, form your own judgment on this. Like, if you think drinking in the meetings is totally cool and that every preacher and minister should be able to drink tumblers of whiskey while they're serving, I guess then have at it, like, do your thing. But it's clearly not to the most of the world okay. And then he gets into 69 and 70, and he goes on this whole thing in England, in northern England and Scotland, where he's literally fondling women, taking like young sisters, teenagers and young 20-something sisters on his lap, feeling their breasts, groping them, kissing them on the lips. Like, this is witnessed to by umpteen different people who saw it, including the ladies who he was doing it to. I mean, it is egregious, and it is gross, and it is a complete corruption of anything that is godly. And, if you think that's okay, or if somebody inside thinks that's okay, no, that's on you. But it's not. It's not. If you just read the scriptures plainly, that is not okay behavior, particularly not by a leader. And you read the meetings in Preston, which were printed when I was, I think, in my early 20s. I was horrified. I could not believe that they were printing this garbage. It is utterly horrifying garbage about boobs and butts and sex. It's utterly disgusting shit. It's just dreadful. And, then he shows up at Aberdeen, and he does what he does at Aberdeen. I don't know if he slept with Madeline or not, but they were together in bed naked. That alone is bad enough.
Yeah.
Call it what you want to call it. But the stupid thing is there was all this stuff that's been witnessed to by countless people leading up to Aberdeen, dating into the late 60s. Years, literally years of his misbehavior, his stuff in Paris, his drinking, his bad behavior, his under any other. If I did it, if you did it, anyone did it, we would have been withdrawn from. We would have been treated differently. But because it was him, no one did it, and they said it's okay. That's not what the Bible says. Say what you want. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that the leaders should be held to a higher standard. I mean, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
And it's certainly, there is no connection with biblical principles or teaching if you're a Christian. Like, there's just not. There's just not.
Yeah.
So you have to do these semantic gymnastics and verbal and mental and psychological gymnastics to justify it, and it isn't justifiable. It's nonsense. But the thing about the whole thing at Aberdeen, with Mrs. Kerr being in his bed and the house in Aberdeen, what puts that to complete rest as a defense is, like, a month later, 2 months later, a reporter from some newspaper shows up at his house on East 26th in Brooklyn to talk to him. Let's get his side of the story. That's what the press does. We'll get this side, we'll get that side. They show up, he's sitting there. He literally, I mean, it's embarrassing, actually. I mean, the fact that my family was so closely entwined with him, and I personally, I mean, my wife was his granddaughter. I mean, it's embarrassing. But he has the reporter shown into the room. He's wearing only his underpants and a shirt, drinking a tumbler of whiskey, like 2 months after Aberdeen. And the reporter says something, and he's like, well, I guess I should probably put my pants on, but I feel much more comfortable just wearing my underpants. I mean, it is so outrageous. It is so outrageous that it is, you can't, this expression, you can't make this shit up. You can't make this shit up. This actually happened. And so the idea that this was like Aberdeen was some like carefully choreographed situation is nonsense. He was completely out of control. He was behaving in a way that there is no justification for. In scripture, there is no justification for in the great ministries that preceded him. I don't know if I think they're great, but I mean the ministries that preceded him. There's nothing. There's no justification for it. And he then Mrs. Kerr appears. She's in his house in New York, like 2 months later. He goes and puts some pants on and then sticks his arm around her and cuddles all up to her and says, she's my woman. Like there is no way that any person, I mean, I have no skin in this game. I'm, 50 years hence. I have a really great life. But how people believe that this was somehow divinely sanctioned and of God and based on scripture is nonsense. It's not possible. I mean, obviously God can do anything, but I think God would say, okay, you didn't believe this, got you. Yeah. That was.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, the whole split had taken place. I mean, everyone who was opposed had already been exposed to the so-called ambush. So what was the point in continuing this a month later and with a reporter present? I mean, what about the testimony? We're all told about the brethren are here for the service in God and the testimony, but wow, I mean, why get a reporter involved if the only purpose of this was to provoke a split in the brethren community?
Yeah, I'm just going to bring it up.
I agree with you 100%. It makes no sense. And if you're a Christian and if you believe that God has given us the ability to think and if we have a work of God in us and the Holy Spirit in us to make decisions that are godly or that are based on divine command or biblical principles, this is not it. This is absolutely not. If I was doing this would be shameful.
So this is the article that was written. We'll attach it to a link to it at the end of the podcast in our descriptions if you want to read it. Yeah. And it just goes on to everything that Bradley has talked about. I'm not going to go on it because we have so much to cover today. But it's got everything on here. But
that was the picture taken at the time, isn't it? The one
that's what I wanted to bring on was that
he
got his pants on by that stage, thankfully.
But he's still wearing his pajamas top.
Yeah, so he is.
I mean, it's sad. And honestly, I feel still the sense of like I tend to like flush. I get embarrassed. I feel ashamed. I think it's really dreadful. It's really dreadful.
Yeah.
And then then it moves out of that to this weird JHS period where initially at least there was this kind of like jerk back to center. The people, there was a bunch of people in 1970 and early 71 who started, younger brothers who started kind of orchestrating orgies and all this weird shit with people and claiming it was God's liberty and they were following on Mr. Jim's directive. Like Derek Notes, the whole movement with Derek Notes in South Africa that's still alive, weirdly, with 20 or 30 families, different families. But then JHS kind of grapples and grabs the reins. And my dad tells this funny story about being, by this point, the universal meetings, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They all show up in Bristol because by then the meetings are in Bristol. And my dad goes there and because JT Jr. hadn't been wearing a tie for like 2 years or 3 years. And so he said that my dad said, like at the first meeting, everyone shows up not wearing ties, but JHS shows up wearing a tie. And very, very formal. And my dad said everyone rushed to the meeting afterwards. Went home. If they hadn't packed a tie, they all went to the shops and bought ties. In the next meeting, everyone was wearing ties again. And my dad talked about just the sense of relief that this weird period that they've been under with JHS or with JT Jr. was over. And my dad had hoped that even though JHS was just a farmer and kind of uneducated, but he felt he knew JHS because he married my mom and just knew him personally and in the house. He just felt kind of relieved. He was like, "Oh my God, thank goodness we're back to normal." But that didn't last long, that. that all went out the window. Kind of a funny aside. So anyway, that's kind of what I know.
You know, it makes me so upset and just like it just I don't know how to find words for this. Because of JT Jr. and his attitude and how it was accepted and it's still is believed that he was innocent and pure, has given this years and years and decades of abuse to happen in there, and it been covered up. I'm trying so hard not to break apart here, because it's just had Aberdeen, had JT Jr. been dealt with the way he should have been dealt with, I guarantee what happened to me would have never happened to me.
I agree.
And I guess it's just hard to sit here and the amount of people that are still denying and in denial of what really went on. Do you know, honestly, the reason why we're doing this podcast is because of requests from insiders. So this podcast was not brought together from our own desire. I mean, we don't have no issue doing it, but it was literally emails and messages and phone calls that I was getting after Bradley's podcast for us to do a separate Aberdeen podcast, because this is hidden in there. You can't find information on Aberdeen in there. And the one older gentleman asked me, he said, this younger generation doesn't know about it. And I think it is so important to bring light to the sexual abuse that went on in there. I mean, there was alcoholism, there was all this other stuff that was going on. But if we're dealing with what is very rampant that we're seeing, it's the sexual abuse. And how, I mean, that picture right there with him sitting with her, there was no need, as you say, for her to still be in his house 2 months later. It just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that I have to fight for something that is so blatantly black and white. That is what is sad.
Well, and I think the cover up is like, it's to remind people that there were people that saw what happened and they would write letters. And I know JHS or Grandpa Symington would say, don't open your mail. Don't read the letters. And I know he told it to his kids. He said, if you get letters about what supposedly happened at Aberdeen, don't open them, throw them away. Don't even entertain the thoughts of what people say they saw. So it was a cover up, which he seems like he was good at.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, the two places that suffered the largest losses of brethren in 1970 were in Scotland.
Yeah.
Where almost everyone left.
Yeah.
I mean, out of 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 brethren, I think like 100 were left. In New York City. Who knew him, the place where they saw what went on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the place that knew him the best.
Yeah.
And said, yeah, that rings true.
Yeah.
Those are
very interesting.
So it was the places that knew him or saw things that said, yep, fine, it's time to pay the piper. This doesn't make sense. We got to go. And I think that says a lot.
Well, while more distant places, they could kid themselves that it was a lie. And of course, it was widely spread around that the whole thing was a lie and it wasn't true. And they could say, well, you know, perhaps it was a lie. So let's play safe and stay with the family and kind of not lose everything by going out. Yeah. I think David was actually, were you actually at those Preston meetings, David? Can you give us? Your father was, yeah. Tell us about that again. I know you mentioned it before. What did he say afterwards and so on?
He was horrified. He was utterly horrified. I mean, we all know what that sort of behavior looks like. You know, it's not exclusive to brethren, but to see it happening in a brethren meeting was just abhorrent. But the whole thing is so distasteful. He came back from the Saturday meeting and he said to me privately, and I've no other witness.
Is that Preston, David?
Preston meetings, 3-day meetings. We live we still live in the Manchester area, and Preston is only 30 miles away.
Okay.
So a lot of Manchester brethren went to Preston. I wasn't invited. My father went. He came back and said privately to me he should be taken home and horsewhipped. And he was furious. Next day, he retracted on that and said, I can't believe the man of God has been allowed to fail. If he has, it calls into question the whole recovery of the truth. So he'd basically fudged it, unfortunately. Now, just after Aberdeen, of course, we were getting the Stotts had put out the transcript. Do you remember all that? They put out this book, If We Walk in the Light, which was the transcript of the Aberdeen meetings. And yes, as you said, I think as Carmen said, you had to not read it, you had to not look at it and so on, but it was there, readily available. But of course, the whole topic was taboo. You couldn't raise the subject of Aberdeen at all. But I think it's very telling that when Stanley McCallum said to Jim Taylor in the bedroom at Aberdeen, what would Rennie think, his wife? And Jim Taylor's response was, I suppose you're going to tell her. Yeah. Now that, I think, is a very telling instant reaction on the spot, because his guilt was undeniable. He knew he was in the wrong.
And I think, interestingly enough, James III's wife was so horrified by it that she was actually withdrawn from, or they were shut up for a while because she wouldn't accept what her father-in-law had done. And I understand JT's wife was also very upset about it and couldn't accept it for a while, but eventually she was kind of persuaded to not make an issue of it.
I believe so. Yeah.
There's something terribly sad about the whole thing. Not only for what happened then, but what it gave way to, like Cheryl mentioned earlier, what it allowed for later.
Yes.
It honestly, growing up, my mother would cry every time anybody brought up Aberdeen. And I still feel like it. I still feel like crying. I still have dreams. I still, there's something terribly sad about that thing.
Yeah.
I do. I think it was a pivotal moment that allowed for all of this to happen that we're hearing about now, right? And
I think that the foundation was laid, but that set the stage.
Yes, 100%.
It was like all of the pieces of the set were on the stage.
Yeah.
Like that allowed for the curtain to go up and all this crap to happen.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if you're going to take a man of God position, the elect vessel, I don't care who takes it. That is your responsibility to clean this up. I don't care who is in. I don't know how many. I don't care how many generations later. But I mean, with the amount of stories that have come forward and are continuing to come forward, the amount of phone calls that we get, the emails that come rolling in. I'm in conversation with somebody right now that is, I've explained to him that it is so important and so imperative that Bruce gets off of his throne and looks at what he has discarded into the dump, because that pile has grown and grown and grown. And that's what this movement does all. This isn't about retaliation. This isn't about being an opposer. This is literally about, I could not fathom walking past a burning building with children crying in it. I couldn't. There's no way. I could care if those were my enemy's children. I would go in there and I would get those children. I just would go in there. I would sacrifice myself to pull out a child. That is how a man of God should think. Past, present, and future. The compassion should run so deep inside his heart that it should just be right there. And we do not see that with Bruce. You do not see that at all. And that doesn't mean that I'm sitting here being an opposer of his. I'm just saying his leadership does not exude compassion. I'm going to play this. We have a recording from one of J2 Junior's meetings. So I'm going to, just 1 second here. While I get this all up.
David, where have you been? Thank God for you. Thank God for you every time. And you've been stinking somewhere. Where you been doing that? In hell. You haven't had any privilege to do that. You feeling better? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. Are you feeling better, David? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. The whole thing. So, where were the intestines? Were that trouble? The hell with them. Hell with them. Hell with them. You hear that, George? George! George! Did you hear? Yes. Hell with yelling. Hell with yelling. David's all right. And we going to keep him all right through these evenings. Stay awake, you dude. What do you think we're going to get on with all these songs from Detroit? To hell with them. Hell with them, I said. Hell with them. You big bum, you. You never had it so good. And don't you think you're going to go away with this stuff? You here. What's your name? Son of a bitch. John Gustin. Get up. You look like nothing. Sit down. You never had it like this before. Eric, wait. You wake, Eric. Well, get up and perform. Eric, get up. Get up, Eric. Get up. Eric, get up. Get up. You never had it like this before. Hey, you stupid people here, what do you think I am? I'm a professor. Yeah, you... I'm not finished with you yet. You not get up. I'm not finished with you yet. Well, I'll tell you this. Don't you mention any cars anymore, numbers or what the hell I am. You never had it like this before. That son of a bitch. I be careful using the word son of a bitch because I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. You have to be careful about it. Is everything all right with your bowels? You never had it so good. Oh, no. Sit down. I would like you to introduce you to Nicodemus. And will you answer the question that I will ask you, Nicodemus? You couldn't. Who are you? Who are you? Get the hell out of here. Hell, I said. Hell out of here. You big bum there, you Bennett. What are you doing there? You never had it like this before. Now, we have some other things before us. You know, we don't want to be big before you. I don't want to be. There are things that I would like to bring before you.
You know, the thing that's so sad about that meeting in Aberdeen, the one that is, you know, like Mr. Brown, George Brown, was a really like a kind of a selfless servant who had worked at the depot as editor for umpteen years, and he just totally mocks the crap out of him. And my grandfather wasn't well. He was, I don't know whether he had the flu or what, but he's like trying to go out and go to the bathroom, and JT Jr. is like openly mocking him. I mean, it's just it's so stupid. It's so juvenile, and it's a little bit hard, like I said in my last podcast, to feel bad for some of these guys who like upheld him and like put up with this crap for 10 years. I mean, they all did, right? They all put up with it for years. And Aberdeen was kind of like the crowning glory, but it's just really, it's really sad. Grown older men were like putting up with this abuse and acquiescing to this treatment, you know, allowing him to do the shit that he was doing. It's just appalling. It's just appalling.
And one of the legacies of that, quite apart from the kind of whitewashing of sexual abuse that's sort of continued from that day to this, is this idea that the man of God is completely infallible and can do anything he likes. And that's very current, isn't it?
Can say or do anything.
Yeah.
It's completely unscriptural.
Yeah.
I mean, say what you want, but you cannot claim that based on scriptural principles. You cannot.
Yeah. I mean, I was just looking up Bruce Hale's ministry on the subject in the subject index, and he says, I think he's quoting his father. His father said it's more likely that the sun would fail to rise in the morning than that Mr. Jim could have failed. I mean, that's putting man in the position of God. I mean, the only other people who claim infallibility is the popes. And they only claim it in specific situations. They don't claim to be generally infallible. But the man of God is apparently sinless and infallible. And that's a very large part of the grip that Bruce Hales has on the brethren at the moment, is that they've been brainwashed into believing that this guy is incapable of doing or saying anything wrong.
I mean, the thing that came out was just starting when I laughed about John Hales being sinless. I mean, that is just heretical.
Yes,
that is heretical. That is plainly, on its plain reading, is heretical.
Yeah.
I mean, the scripture says, all have sinned.
Yeah.
And come short of the glory of God. All have sinned. So if you are a Christian, if someone says this man is sinless, that is heretical. That is against scripture, and that is against the teaching of the word of God. There is no other way around it.
It's blasphemy. It's complete blasphemy.
And then that's only kind of grown to, I mean, this point of this, it's It's like, again, kind of embarrassing. Like Bruce Hales doesn't have body odor. Like he's so holy. It's just so weird and juvenile. And
Yep.
like, no, he's a human. I mean, even Jesus was human.
Yeah.
Jesus and divine. He was like us in all manner, sin apart. I mean, that's the reality. And to try and claim this godlike stature for men who are no different than you and I, no different, is heretical. It is blasphemy.
And that stature again,
heretical. It is blasphemy.
Yeah, and that stature again is giving Bruce Hales the capability to do whatever and get away with whatever. Do you know, I had an ex-member who had spoken to her parents just recently about his mansion, and they were like, absolutely not. He would never spend that kind of money on a house. She says that's not true. That's not true. And literally sent the news articles to them, whether they could open them or not. But talking to another young fella overseas, and he's the same thing as like, he says, we don't get away with anything, but the higher up you are, you get away with so much. You know, there's a flight ban that was put on. People that are higher up get to do whatever they want, but yet everybody else has to stay housebound. You know, it's just.
Yeah, the Christmas travel ban. Yeah, every Christmas they do. Oh no, you can't travel for Christmas. It's pure
like,
ball sportism. Yeah.
If Bruce is so concerned about why there's such division happening, like if he truly was taking this core magnifying glass look at what has happened in the past, and that this past has created his future, his present, and the future that he's going into, right? Like anybody can see of where the issues are stemming from and why it's still just repeating it. The history just keeps repeating itself. You know, maybe sure we're not going to see Bruce Hales act like JT Jr., but all the same,
we're not going to.
Pardon?
I don't know if we're not going to. We might.
Yeah.
Do you think the mass delusion that is evident here is epitomized at Aberdeen, where you've got a lot of people observing and listening to this stuff, but still supporting and cheering and so on? Is do you think that Aberdeen has sort of brought it to a complete flowering of hypocrisy?
Yes.
The week before, my father said one of the things that was sickening was to see the queue of sisters queuing up, seeing what was happening to the ones in front of them, but still wanting to go and sit on JT Jr.'s lap. Now that power of, he said it was awful. You know, people willingly suspending their judgment, and this is what's going on still. You know, they completely unable to see clearly what's right in front of their faces.
It's such abuse of power,
Yeah.
And I mean, there's abuse of power everywhere. It's in all the institutions, but it should not be inside a quote unquote mainstream Christian church.
Well, I think this is the fundamental issue that sometimes gets overlooked is that the reason Aberdeen arose, so yes, it did not happen under JND or FER or JT, but the reason it arose was the structure that was set up under them.
Yes.
Where there was no accountability.
Yeah.
There was no process for appointment of elders, leaders, and deacons, and the biblical stuff. There was no venue or forum for believers to be protected and raise concerns about. There wasn't. It was not. I'm struggling for the word here, but it was like purposefully denied JND.
Yeah.
He explicitly said he did not want that kind of thing because that would shut down the Spirit of God. And what I think, from my perspective is, as a Christian who's come through a lot of stuff, is that the structures that churches put in place are actually led by the Spirit of God. The structures are guided by the Spirit of God to help our human weakness deal with what we have to deal with. And Aberdeen is the genuine, real culmination of what happens when you allow unfettered access to power.
Tends to corrupt. absolute power to corrupt absolutely. It's not a scripture, but it's very true.
It's true. I mean, it does. I mean, he was doing shit, and you look at the men swept up in this. I mean, this is the sad thing to me. Like my grandfather, Mr. Gardner, AJ Gardner, all these different guys who supported him, even through the worst of it. I mean, yes, Aberdeen, it finally broke for most of them, but they were supporting him through really bad shit.
Yeah.
They turned the other way.
Mm.
Well, a lot of this crap was going on.
Just the
If
cost
they had stood up, if they had stood up in
yes.
if they had stood up in 59, if they had stood up in 64, if they had stood up in 66, if they had stood up in any of these years and said, this is wrong,
Yeah.
it would have
Yeah.
stuck.
Yeah.
But they didn't. They didn't. And that is on them. And it is what it is. But it is not that it just appeared out of the blue in 1970.
Yes.
It was
Yeah.
built
I did.
years and years and years.
So yeah, I went on with it. You know, it wasn't the cost of standing up and objecting was so high that I kept putting it off.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I knew what would happen.
Yeah.
And
David, I am the same. I can't claim anything until the moment I left. I have to accept responsibility for supporting what was going on.
yeah, that's why I'm so thankful to Mr. Symington. As I told his granddaughter, he gave me the opportunity to step back and look at it, because he shut me up for my wife going to watch the royal wedding.
Oh, how terrible! How terrible!
Yeah.
How terrible!
Incidentally, you asked, was I at Central Hall, Westminster in 1959?
Yes.
Nisi was there. She's on the photograph.
Oh, really?
She was
Oh,
only
yeah.
13, so she doesn't. She remembers the squabbles and the tension, but not the detail.
Huh.
So we have an eyewitness to that meeting.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this has to happen again, right? Like, I mean, we're reaching a climax again where this isn't a one-time incident that's going to happen in the future. This is a buildup. It's an accumulation of things. I don't know. How do people stand up and say, this is wrong? That's what has to happen with Bruce. People need to stand up and say, this is wrong. I mean,
that's it. And the heads are chopped off immediately.
I know. And that's what I mean. Like, I don't know. Like, how do you do it? How does somebody gain the courage to stand up, or enough of them, and say that this is wrong, put an end to it? But that's what needs to happen. But how do you do it?
Yeah, I think one of the really big things is much different than 1970 or even later is their financial well-being is all tied up in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I left with nothing. You left with nothing.
Mhm.
Richard left with nothing. Most of us did.
Yeah.
But it's terribly fearful for most people to say, I'm going to leave and I'm literally going to live on the street, or I'm not going to have a clear picture of where my next meal is coming from. When you're prepared to do that because of your preparedness to say the untruths and the lies and the bullshit and the carry that's just deceitful and ugly and horrible and against God's principles. If you're prepared to say that and you're prepared to walk away and let that fall where it may, that makes the difference. But
Would you say, Bradley, that in doing that, like for myself, because I left the way that I left with nothing and to nothing, I have my connection to myself and my faith within me is untouchable now.
Yes.
And I think when we sit here and I'm like, I don't want to disrespect anybody's fear or the length of fear that you have to go through and everything that you've got to overcome to get up and leave. But at some point, you have to be worth more than your finances, your house, everything that is around you. You yourself is worth more than staying in something that is so inherently corrupt and evil.
you have to be prepared to leave. You have to be prepared to leave your money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, money is just paper. It is just paper.
Yeah.
Like it's not there's ways to build your life back up. And when you get to do it by yourself with your own bare hands and whoever you tend to leave with, there's such a community feel to it. There's such an empowering sense of, I picked myself back up by myself and I'm standing. I don't have a lot of money, for crying out loud. I still rent, but I don't care, right? Money is not at the forefront in my life. To me, it's friendship, it's family connections. It's making sure that I'm always true to myself and my surroundings. But most of all, it is about standing up for yourself and those that have been wrongly abused. So I will keep doing whatever I need to do in order to speak up for those that have been abused and don't have a voice yet, right? And to me, I think that is one of the most powerful things to do, is to be a voice for someone until they get their voice. And there's plenty of people that have contacted all of us in there that I know have the capability to stand up and say, this is wrong.
Yeah.
They're seeing through it. The thing that ties them is finances. But I can tell you, money, it doesn't matter. Money, it's not,
Well,
you're taken care of. I've been taken care of for 30 years. Sometimes I didn't know how I was going to get from month to month, but I still made it.
yeah, we were taken care of. No question about it. God picked us up and looked after us wonderfully. But the problem is, it's not just money. It's the rest of your family.
It is the family. Yeah.
You have to leave behind all the people who won't come with you. And that's the hardest thing.
But I do believe, this is what I believe. I believe that if enough people do it, Bruce will have to change that rule. There will be some sort of, that's how I envision it, is that if enough people do it and enough people stand up and say this is wrong, to me, that separation rule is not biblical. It does not come from any teachings that he's coming from. To me, it is just a way for him to keep separation, for his flock to be focused on him and not anything else.
But it's completely necessary, because if they could freely talk to us.
Oh yeah, no, he wouldn't have what he has.
Yeah. Don't fall to bits. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've said this before. I just want to keep saying it to people inside. The wall of separation is not to keep the world out. The wall of separation is to keep you in. It's a prison wall.
Yes. Berlin was a prime example of that. Yeah. Berlin was to keep the East Berlinians in the communist state. It wasn't to protect them at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happened?
And I think, David, what really showed that up, for those of us who remember, was when the wall came down, when they started knocking down sections of it, there weren't people in the West rushing into the East.
Yeah.
It was people rushing from the East into the West.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's really sad, actually.
It is so sad.
But it is up to every individual inside. It is up to every individual to make the decision. Will you follow biblical principles? Will you read for yourself Jesus's words? Will you do the things that are instructed to you if you want to be brethren by the early brethren? Or are you just going to go along with this current bullshit? Because the current stuff is bullshit.
Yeah.
It is completely different than the old
Absolutely,
stuff.
yeah.
It is completely different from if you just read the Bible plainly.
Yeah.
Stick with the J&D version if you want. Read it. It does not tell you to do what you're being asked to do. So make the decision yourself. I mean, I'm not telling you what to do. Like, do your thing. But make the decision that's right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I mean, the whole thing has been built on sand. It doesn't have a foundation of block. And eventually that sand is wearing down, and it will fall.
It will.
You know, there's no solid construction in it.
I mean, the whole current Brethren edifice has no structure to it.
Yeah.
All the property belongs to Bruce Hales personally.
Yep. And that's by design. You have to realize he's done that on purpose. He has restrained and constrained all their finances on purpose to limit the amount of movement of people that might have the desire to leave. If you can't take your finances, you're going to stay. It's by design.
All of their leadership is tied up in the UBT whole sort of network of stuff.
Yeah.
It's just break out. You can.
One big difference, though.
Maybe everyone inside should watch the Truman Show.
Yes.
And be like, holy crap, unbelievable! It's all a facade.
We're all Truman. But the big difference these days is the internet.
Yeah.
That is a huge difference. I mean, we couldn't do this without. And you've got some very intelligent people on the internet who are picking apart what the Brethren leadership have liked to keep concealed. And I think that's really valuable work because it's exposing the rottenness at the core of the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree. I was sitting here just realizing that we didn't really explain Aberdeen, what it is, to people who are not part of the Brethren. We just kind of jumped in. Bradley, do you want to just give a brief synopsis to people who wouldn't even know what we're talking about when we say Aberdeen?
So the Brethren,
10 minutes.
Well, from close to the beginning, have recognized a leader as their sort of spiritual guide, their pope, essentially the Brethren pope. And in 1970, that person was hosting or leading conferences in Aberdeen, Scotland. And during that conference, was suspected of bad behavior with a married brother and sister. And so during the course of the conference, certain brethren people went into his room, knocked on the door and then went in and confronted him. And he was in bed naked with a naked young brother lady. And he claimed that he was doing this as an ambush, that he was doing this as a way to catch or to draw out position to himself from people who were opposed to him. I think that kind of sums it up.
Yeah.
I mean, all the brethren in Scotland left because they're like, we know all the people who saw this crap happen. That was not what was going on. He was just sleeping with a young lady. That's bullshit. So all the brethren in Scotland left, but half the brethren, or more than half, 3/4 of the brethren in New York left. But who knew him, actually. And most of the other brethren stayed, honestly. So there was this huge rupture. But this event, what's called Aberdeen, or the Aberdeen incident, still remains very pivotal in the Brethren psyche. Whether you believe that JT Jr. was pure, he was purely naked in bed with a naked young lady. I guess that's a definition of purity I'm not familiar with, but that's purity in their idea. And if you accept that JT Jr. was pure, and that he was purely naked, and he was purely in bed with Madeline, who was naked, and everything was pure and everything was good to go. Yeah, I guess that's what you believe, but it's stupid. It's stupid.
But it's the key thing is it's a test of fellowship. I mean, if you were a current member of the PBCC, Plymouth Brethren Church, and you were to express even privately that you felt that JT Jr. shouldn't have been doing that, you would be withdrawn from. You would be excommunicated overnight, instantly.
Yeah.
So I think the instantaneousness of the whole Aberdeen thing is because they know it's so volatile.
Yes, so dangerous to them. Yeah.
We know that this is the real This is the real bullshit. This
Yeah.
this is the incontrovertible crap that will set the whole thing up in flames if anyone believes it.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it is. I mean, there were multiple people in that room, in the bedroom. If we go back, let's just go back. Not dealing with all the crap that he said in Preston, not all him kissing all the young ladies and squeezing their tits, like not all that shit. Let's avoid all that for the moment. And just talk about when the brothers entered his room. There were multiple brothers there who saw Madeline naked, saw JT Jr. naked. And you're going to believe that didn't happen? Or that this was somehow God's will? That's bullshit. That is complete bullshit. That is so stupid. It beggars belief that people believe it. I can't believe I believed it. I mean, it's utterly not.
It wasn't worth making a fuss about.
At some point, yes. No, exactly. It's like, no. I mean, I have relatives who were like, no. Like, it was so egregious. It was so obvious. It was witnessed to by so many people. Why would we even talk about it? Of course not. We're going to move on.
Yeah. I was talking to an ex-member a couple of weeks ago, and he said, we got talking about Aberdeen. Oh, we lost him. I got talking about Aberdeen, and he said that, he's like, I honestly thought Aberdeen was just a swear word. He's like, I didn't realize it was a place. It was a swear word. He's like, I grew up thinking it was just a swear word.
How funny.
Oh, it's kind of funny. Anyhow, well, we lost Bradley.
That was valuable stuff that Bradley had. Some of that I didn't know. But
He's a wise man.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Well, I guess thank you, Bradley, for joining us, and David for joining us and letting us dive into this. I will attach the link of the transcript. I'm not sure all what we're going to put up, so just look below in the description of what we end up deciding on attaching onto here. And
thank you for Nisi joining us too.
Yes.
Yeah.
She just brings a smile to my face.
Yeah.
She's had her evening medication mixed with ice cream, but it actually makes her very sleepy.
Oh.
Say goodbye, darling.
Oh.
Okay. Well, until next time, everyone, thank you for watching, and we will do a part 2 if one is required from our feedback.
Yep.
Much love to you all.
Thank you so much for what you're doing. Richard, sometime I'm going to hook up with you on FaceTime when you're ready.
Yeah, sure. We could do that. We could do that very shortly if you like.
Okay.
Yep.
To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me.